On the morning of October 19, 1781, Charles Cornwallis sent a message to George Washington. He said he was too ill to attend the surrender ceremony. He sent a subordinate in his place, a man named Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to hand over his sword. Washington refused to accept it personally. He made his own subordinate take it instead. 2 proxies, standing in a field, completing the transaction that ended the British Empire's grip on America. Cornwallis was not ill. Everyone knew it. He simply could not bring himself to stand in that field and hand over everything he had spent 2 years fighting for. And the bitter irony is that Cornwallis had not lost because he was outgeneraled at Yorktown. He had lost because of a single morning 9 months earlier, on a frozen cattle field in South Carolina, where a backwoods general, with no formal education, had set a trap so perfect that the entire British Southern strategy unraveled before Cornwallis even understood what had happened. Charles Cornwallis was not supposed to lose this war. He was one of the most decorated officers in the British Army, educated at Eton, trained at a military academy in Turin, a veteran of the 7 Years' War. He had wealth, connections, and the full backing of the crown. When he arrived in the American colonies, he won. Charleston fell in May 1780, the worst American defeat of the entire war. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers taken prisoner in a single engagement. Cornwallis controlled most of the southern colonies by autumn. British strategy was working. The plan was to pacify the South, use it as a base, and drive northward until Washington had nowhere left to fight. It was a sound plan. Cornwallis was the right man to execute it. And then Daniel Morgan ruined everything. Morgan was everything Cornwallis was not. Poor, self-educated, scarred across his back from 500 lashes a British officer had ordered during the French and Indian War. He had fought his way up from nothing, hauling supplies through the Virginia wilderness as a young man, then turning up at the start of the Revolution with a company of riflemen and a personal hatred of the British military that never left him. By January 1781, Morgan was operating in the Carolina backcountry with roughly 1,000 men, half of them untrained militia. Cornwallis sent his most aggressive field commander after him, a 26-year-old cavalry officer named Banastre Tarleton, known across the colonies as Bloody Tarleton, a man who believed that speed and shock could break any American force before it had time to think. Tarleton pushed his men through frozen darkness on the night of January 16th, 8 miles of muddy trails and swollen creeks, arriving at a place called the Cowpens at dawn with over 1,000 of the best trained soldiers in the British Army. His men were exhausted. He had conducted no meaningful reconnaissance. He ordered an immediate assault. What he did not know was that Morgan had spent the entire previous night walking from campfire to campfire, crouching down with groups of shivering militiamen, telling them jokes, sharing stories from Saratoga, and explaining exactly what he needed each man to do. Not stand and fight, not hold the line, fire 2 shots, then walk away. Morgan had designed a battle around the certainty that his militia would retreat. The retreat was not a flaw in the plan. The retreat was the plan. When Tarleton's line advanced across the frozen pasture, the front rifleman picked off his officers and melted backward. The militia fired 2 devastating volleys at 50 yards, and then turned and walked away. Tarleton's men saw the Americans retreating and did what Morgan knew they would do. They broke formation and charged, screaming, bayonets forward, certain the fight was already won. They crested a low rise and ran directly into 450 Continental regulars, fresh and loaded, standing shoulder to shoulder in a disciplined line. The volley hit the charging British formation at point-blank range. Before the survivors could recover, cavalry thundered out from behind a hidden hill and smashed into their exposed flank. And then the militia, the men who had supposedly fled, reappeared on the opposite side of the field, reformed and advancing with loaded muskets. The British were being hit from 3 sides simultaneously. They had been sprinting toward victory 30 seconds earlier. Now they were surrounded. The army broke. Tarleton lost over 80% of his command in under an hour. He escaped on horseback with a handful of dragoons and rode hard to find Cornwallis. What Cornwallis felt when he heard the report can only be imagined. In one morning he had lost a quarter of his light troops and his most effective field commander, but the material losses were almost secondary to what Cowpens had done to British strategic assumptions. Every officer in the Southern theatre had built their approach around one foundational belief: American militia would always break under a bayonet charge. Morgan had just proven that belief dead wrong, and every British commander from Savannah to Wilmington felt the ground shift beneath them. Cornwallis made a decision at this point that military historians still argue over. Rather than consolidate, resupply, and rebuild his strength, he burned his own supply wagons, stripped his army to fighting weight, and chased Greene's Continental force north into Virginia. It was a decision born from fury, not strategy. He was going to destroy the American army through sheer aggression and willpower, the same way Tarleton had always operated. But Tarleton's approach had just cost him a quarter of his army. Cornwallis was now running the same playbook at a larger scale, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point, marching his men into increasingly hostile territory, further and further from his coastal bases of support, with no clear endgame except the destruction of an enemy that kept refusing to be destroyed. By summer 1781, Cornwallis had maneuvered himself into a position that made a kind of tactical sense and a kind of strategic nonsense simultaneously. He occupied Yorktown, a small tobacco port on the Virginia coast, intending to use it as a resupply base and wait for the Royal Navy to reinforce him. It was a reasonable plan if the Navy arrived. The Navy did not arrive. What arrived instead was a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, which met the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake in early September, and drove it off. The sea lane closed. Cornwallis was cut off. And then Washington, who had been watching from the north, made the most important decision of his generalship. He abandoned his planned attack on New York, turned his entire army south, and marched it to Virginia in secret. By the time Cornwallis understood what was happening, 17,000 American and French troops were surrounding Yorktown on land, and a French fleet controlled the water. There was no relief coming. There was no escape route. There was nothing left to do. The siege lasted 3 weeks. The French and American artillery systematically destroyed Yorktown's defenses, redoubt by redoubt, trench by trench. Cornwallis sent a message on October 17th offering to negotiate. 2 days later, his army marched out between 2 lines of Allied troops stretching for over a mile, the French in their white uniforms on one side, the Americans in their ragged Continental blue on the other. A British military band played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether that was chosen deliberately or ironically, nobody recorded. It was accurate either way. Cornwallis stayed in his headquarters and claimed illness. O'Hara brought the sword. Washington refused it. The war was over in everything but paperwork. The thing about Cornwallis is that he was not incompetent. He was a genuinely skilled commander who won more engagements than he lost and executed a coherent Southern strategy with considerable effectiveness, right up until Cowpens. What broke him was not a superior general. What broke him was one night in January, when Daniel Morgan walked between campfires in the freezing dark and explained a battle plan to farmers and shopkeepers, and those farmers and shopkeepers executed it perfectly. And a 26-year-old cavalry officer with too much confidence and too little sleep charged straight into a trap he never saw coming. That 1 hour on a cattle field in South Carolina began a chain of consequences that Cornwallis could never reverse. No matter how fast he marched or how many supply wagons he burned or how aggressively he pushed his exhausted men through the Virginia summer, the Empire did not break at Yorktown. It broke at Cowpens. Yorktown was just where Cornwallis finally ran out of road. He returned to Britain, was not court-martialed, was not disgraced, and was eventually appointed Governor-General of India, where he governed with considerable distinction. History treated him gently. The farmers and shopkeepers who lit the fuse went back to their fields. Morgan retired to his farm in Virginia, his back still carrying the scars of 500 lashes, and never commanded troops again. He had done what he came to do.